Our last section in Chapter 2 has to do with cells and energy. And it has to do with two processes, and you can see two organelles up there. Hopefully you recognize what's on the left. That is, see if you got it right, chloroplast. And then on the right is mitochondrion. And we're going to study these two processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration in two parts. This one is concerned with cellular respiration, excuse me, which takes place in the mitochondria on the right. The key concepts are for this first part is how does a cell obtain energy? And how do some cells make food molecules? That will be in part 2 because that's the photosynthesis part. Cellular respiration takes place, most of it, in the mitochondrion. Here's the definition that you need to know for cellular respiration. It's a series of chemical reactions, so it's not just one. And it converts energy in food molecules into a usable form of energy that's called ATP. That's actually abbreviation for it. Adenosine triphosphate is what the ATP stands for. So it's the breaking down of an energy source. The most common energy source you're going to see is glucose, but it's not the only one. And by cells to obtain that usable energy. The usable energy of a cell is ATP. It's just like there's energy in fuel, in gasoline. But if you put it into anything other than a motor in which it is used, that it uses that kind of fuel, it's not going to help. You put that in something else, let's say what else would need energy? Let's say for a light bulb. It's not going to work. You put it in a car, it will work. So the most common energy source is glucose. It's a sugar. And the other types of food products that can be used are fats, oils, and proteins, etc. But the most common is the sugar glucose. Cellular respiration contains or has to have many enzymes. Now, I don't think we've studied an enzyme. Enzymes are actually proteins, so this is one important part of what proteins do. Enzymes are catalysts. Now, what a catalyst does, it's going to help change some other substances. In other words, it's going to help a process to take place, but it's not going to be permanently changed itself. It's like if you, let's say we're going to make a doghouse. Now, if I tell you to make a doghouse, you could make one real crude looking without any tools, because people have to do, make lean ways and so forth out in nature if they're caught out there. But if I give you some tools, a hammer, saw, so forth, it's going to make that process go faster. And catalysts speed up or slow down chemical reactions. And in this case, it's actually speeding up the chemical reaction. There are two types of cellular respiration: aerobic cellular respiration and anaerobic. And the difference between the two, think of aerobic, air, what's in the air, oxygen. So aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen. Anaerobic cellular respiration does not require oxygen. Which is the most common way? Aerobic. Most organisms have to have air. And the reason that you breathe, the reason, you ask somebody why they breathe, they're going to say to stay alive. But why? How is it helping you stay alive? This is why. Your sole purpose of breathing is to get that oxygen from the air into the cells and into the mitochondrion to break down glucose to get usable energy, ATP. That's why we breathe. That's why animals breathe. That's why any organism that requires oxygen. They may not breathe like a fish. They have gills and they get their oxygen out of the water. So any organism that requires oxygen, this is why. And a lot of people don't realize, if you ask them about plants, do they require oxygen? Most people will say no. They'll say they give off oxygen for us to breathe. But they require oxygen for the same reason we do. Cellular respiration. Aerobic cellular respiration. Now, why would we have anaerobic? Well, there's actually some organisms that live in conditions where there either is very little oxygen or no oxygen. And that's called anaerobic cellular respiration. So like bacteria and some fungi. We're going to talk about aerobic first. So aerobic cellular respiration, the first few steps for breaking down this glucose molecule is it takes place in the cytoplasm. So it doesn't take place in the mitochondria. Actually, aerobic cellular respiration begins in the cytoplasm. This particular part of cellular respiration is called glycolysis. Glycolysis. Most takes place in the mitochondrion, and your book refers to this particular stage as the reactions in the mitochondrion. Technically, it has two different stages that take place. There are essentially three parts of cellular respiration. Glycolysis, which we just mentioned, and then what your book just kind of refers to reactions that occur in the mitochondrion. Technically, it's called, the next phase would be the Krebs cycle, or some books will refer to it as the citric acid cycle. And then the last part of aerobic cellular respiration is called an electron transport. Now, we're not going to refer back to the Krebs cycle electron transport. You'll study all about that when you get in biology in a little more depth. I just wanted you to know that they really had names. It's not just called reactions in the mitochondrion. So glycolysis, let's look at it. Glycolysis is the first step in cellular respiration. It's a process which glucose is broken down into smaller molecules, and it occurs in the cytoplasm. It's interesting why they called it glycolysis. The literal translation of that word, glycolysis, means splitting sugar. And that's what glucose is. It's a sugar. And so there's several different, there's actually, in this particular glycolysis, there's actually 9 reactions that take place. And it is catalyzed by specific enzymes. And they make up the process that we call glycolysis. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. And so by glycolysis, what happens is that glucose, the 6-carbon sugar, is actually split into 2 molecules of 3-carbon sugars. Glycolysis can occur with or without oxygen. In the presence of oxygen, glycolysis is the first step of aerobic cellular respiration. Later on, we're going to learn that without oxygen, glycolysis then allows the cells to make small amounts of ATP, and we're going to learn that that process is actually called fermentation, and it's under anaerobic cellular respiration. So all you need to know here is the definition of glycolysis. Now, cellular respiration, in glycolysis, you are, as you can see by the diagram there, the cell is taking in glucose, and the cell is actually having to use some ATP, some energy, to do this. It gives off a little bit of energy, and it breaks down, as I said, into those 3, the glucose molecules. Breaks down into smaller molecules. And so then it goes into the mitochondrion. And it's in the mitochondrion that you're really going to get the excess ATP, the stored, that ready-to-use chemical energy for the cells. So the second step of the cellular respiration does require oxygen and occurs in the mitochondrion of eukaryotic cells. The smaller molecules made from glucose during glycolysis are broken down. And large amounts of ATP. Usually they say when you break down one glucose molecule that through aerobic cellular respiration you get anywhere between 36 and 38 ATP molecules from it. And cells use that ATP to power all of the cellular processes. So look at the stages here. Step 1, which takes place outside of the mitochondria and in the cytoplasm, is glycolysis. And the Krebs cycle and so forth, that's inside. And that's where most of the energy is going to be made. Now I want you to get this down in your notes and make sure for your quiz you know the equation or the formula for aerobic cellular respiration. And you can just learn the words. And again, when you get to biology, you get to learn the actual chemical symbols for glucose, which is C6H12O2. And why is it that? Because there's 6 carbons, 12 hydrogen, and 6 oxygen that make up glucose. So you need to know that on the right side of the arrow in a biological equation, you have what are called the ingredients, what it needs to be inputted in order for this reaction to occur. So we have to have 2 ingredients. We have to have glucose, we have oxygen. Where's the glucose coming from? The food that we eat. And that's the purpose of digestion. It's to break it down, that food that we eat, into small enough molecules, glucose. The blood transports it to all the cells, and then it is used in the process of cellular respiration. So, glucose plus oxygen. Now, the way they read an arrow in a biological equation, yields in the presence of. And what you write above that arrow is the actual catalysts that are needed for that process to occur, which in this case it's several enzymes, different kinds. Then on the right side of the equation you put what are the products. And of course the main product is the ATP. 38 or 36 molecules of ATP from one glucose molecule. But we got a couple of waste products, or they really refer to them as byproducts. And that is carbon dioxide, that's the CO2, and water, the H2O. So carbon dioxide, what do we do with that? Well, we can't use it. So that's why we exhale a lot of carbon dioxide, because our blood is going to take that byproduct, which is waste to us, and it's going to take it to the lungs, and then we're going to breathe it out. And the water, of course, can be used for other things in our cells. So the next process, which does not require energy, is referred to, remember, as anaerobic. Ana means without. Anaerobic, without oxygen. So some cells exist, as I was saying, in environments that do not have much or any oxygen available. There are bacteria that live in the lower parts of swamps, lakes, actually deep in the ocean, where there is little or no oxygen. There's other kinds of cells, though, that normally do carry out aerobic cellular respiration, but on an occasional, like emergency type situation, they have to revert because they're not getting enough oxygen to anaerobic cellular respiration. And one of the main things we're going to talk about is in your body. And it is when your muscles need more energy. Such like you're doing a task that you're not used to doing with those muscles. Like if you had first day of basketball practice, you had to run a lot of suicides, and you're sore the next day. We're going to talk about why you're sore. So types of anaerobic cellular respiration are actually named for, remember, byproducts. What are byproducts? They're the extra things that are left over by this process other than the ATP. And so they name this process, first of all, fermentation. So anaerobic cellular respiration is fermentation. And yes, it's the kind of fermentation when you talk about apple juice or some kind of juice or grapes fermenting. That's what it means. It's fermentation, anaerobic cellular respiration. So there's two kinds because it depends on the organism. Sometimes alcohol is actually a byproduct, and sometimes lactic acid is a byproduct. So they name these processes of fermentation of anaerobic cellular respiration after what the byproduct is. So we're going to look at each of these. So fermentation is a reaction that eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells use to obtain energy from food when oxygen levels are low or not even there. Fermentation occurs in cells' cytoplasm. It does not occur in the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion only does aerobic cellular respiration with oxygen. Okay, let's look at alcoholic fermentation. As I said, alcoholic fermentation, the byproduct, of course, the main thing is ATP molecules. By the way, it's less efficient. Usually from one one glucose molecule, at the end of fermentation, you only get like 15. Now remember, with aerobic, you get like 36 or 38, so it's much more efficient than the anaerobic. So that would be, again, why God chose that to be the main way for most cells to get their ATP molecules. So anaerobic cellular respiration that produces alcohol and carbon dioxide as byproducts from the glucose is known as alcoholic fermentation. The good use of this is in yeast. Of course, the bad use is making stills and making liquor. This is how they made liquor from corn and other things. They used anaerobic cellular respiration. The good is yeast. Now think about it. In yeast, if you've ever seen your mom or dad or anybody make yeast rolls or yeast bread, they have to take a little package that they buy at the store. Now what is in there are spores, and inside that spore is a real living yeast cell. And you put it in warm water, and that releases those living cells, those living organisms. They're actually living organisms that are unicellular. And so you put that into bread and into whatever else you put into the dough, and you knead it. That means you mix it and mix it with your hands. And then they take the pan and they're going to put it in a room that is warm. And they're going to let it sit for an hour, 2 hours, and it's going to rise. It's going to double in its size. Now, how come it rises? Well, as those organisms are using the sugar, because that's one of the things that you put into the bread is sugar. As they use that sugar, they're going to break it down without oxygen, and they're going to get their ATP that they need, but they're going to be given off alcohol and carbon dioxide. And if you ever smell yeast dough, pay close attention next time, because you can actually smell the alcohol in it. Now, what happens to that alcohol? Well, you take that bread, you put it in the oven, and when you bake it, the alcohol then evaporates. So you don't have the alcohol left in the bread. The carbon dioxide also is just a gas. So when you cut open a loaf of bread, you see all those little tiny holes everywhere? Those little tiny holes are where the carbon dioxide bubbles were and where the alcohol was present. That's what makes all those little tiny holes in there. And that's also what's causing the bread yeast, the yeast in the bread, to rise. And that's alcoholic fermentation. The other is called lactic acid fermentation. Now, in it, yes, it takes glucose, breaks it down without oxygen in the cytoplasm of the cell, and instead of getting alcohol and carbon dioxide, you get a substance that is called lactic acid. Now, this lactic acid, we have found some good uses for it in making foods. It's actually in the process of making yogurt. Yogurt, you use bacteria. And the bacteria take the sugar in the yogurt mixture and they break it down without oxygen, and they have a byproduct called lactic acid. Cottage cheese, buttermilk, sauerkraut, all of those processes to form those foods are using lactic acid to produce then the taste and the texture of that substance. In us, a good example is, and the only example really in us of a cell that carries out lactic acid fermentation, is our muscle cells. And as I was saying, if you're exercising, doing something that you normally don't do, and you're using some muscle cells, and you're doing all those suicides the first day of practice, and all of a sudden, your cells are like, whoa, I don't have enough oxygen. So they start reverting to an emergency measure of starting to break down that sugar without. Now, there's a price to pay, because that lactic acid, when it builds up in your muscle cells, that is what causes the soreness. So when you wake up the next morning, I'm not talking about if you have a bruise or been hit. I'm talking about just doing some exercise, doing something you haven't been doing, waking up the next day, and it's sore to move those muscles. That's the lactic acid buildup. And of course, it takes the best thing to do the same activity to get that soreness out, because what has to happen is that lactic acid has to be broken down. Otherwise, you're going to stay sore. So look at the two processes here. Muscle cells in humans, lactic acid fermentation. Yeast cells, dough, alcoholic fermentation. Both starting with glucose, both not using oxygen, both occurring in the cytoplasm of the cells, and they get ATP, not as much as with aerobic. But look at the byproducts. Lactic acid, the other one carbon dioxide and alcohol. So that is